Welcome to our deep dive into the structure of U.S. constitutional law. We begin with the judiciary's most potent tool, judicial review. Judicial review, or JR, is the power of the courts to examine acts of the legislative and executive branches, Congress and the President, and declare them unconstitutional, rendering them void. Interestingly, this immense power is not explicitly written anywhere in the Constitution. It is an implied authority derived from the structure of the document itself. This immediately raises the central question for this entire video series. When exactly can the judiciary exercise this power? The answer lies in a set of critical gatekeeping rules known as justiciability. Justiciability encompasses the threshold doctrines that must be satisfied before the court can even consider the merits of a constitutional challenge. Think of it as the mandatory entry ticket to the courthouse. To understand how the judiciary claimed this power of judicial review, we must turn to the foundational case, Marbury v. Madison from 1803. The facts involved William Marbury, who was appointed a justice of the peace by President Adams, but whose commission was never delivered by the incoming Secretary of State, James Madison. Marbury sued directly in the Supreme Court, asking for a writ of mandamus to compel delivery, relying on the Judiciary Act of 1789, which purported to grant the court original jurisdiction for such writs. Chief Justice John Marshall navigated this political minefield brilliantly. His reasoning established two critical points. First, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Second, it is inherently the duty of the judicial branch to interpret that supreme law when applying it to resolve specific legal disputes. Crucially, Marshall did not immediately strike down a major federal statute. Instead, he asserted the court's authority by interpreting the Judiciary Act of 1789 against the Constitution. He found that the act unconstitutionally expanded the Supreme Court's original jurisdiction beyond what Article 3 specified, thereby establishing the precedent for judicial review. Now that we understand how the court claimed the power of judicial review in Marbury, we must examine its practical scope. This power allows the court to review the constitutionality of federal statutes, though this application has evolved significantly. Early attempts, like striking down parts of the Missouri Compromise in Dred Scott, were highly controversial. Today, federal statute review often centers on the limits of congressional power, such as under the Commerce Clause. Furthermore, judicial review extends to state laws and executive actions through the Supremacy Clause, ensuring federal law prevails. However, despite possessing this immense authority, the Supreme Court is historically very reluctant to strike down acts of the political branches. This reluctance is not arbitrary. It reflects a deep institutional concern about separation of powers. This inherent caution directly mandates strict jurisdictional gatekeeping, which brings us to the essential framework governing when the court can actually hear a case: the doctrines of justiciability. The institutional restraint we just discussed mandates strict jurisdictional gatekeeping. This gatekeeping is governed by the doctrines of justiciability. Justiciability is the umbrella term for the constitutional requirements, rooted in Article 3 of the Constitution, and certain prudential rules that ensure the federal courts only resolve genuine cases or controversies. If a matter is not justiciable, the court lacks the fundamental authority to hear the dispute, no matter how significant the underlying constitutional question may be. There are 5 core doctrines that must all be satisfied. First, the parties must have standing. Second, the claim must be ripe for review. Third, the case cannot be moot. Fourth, the issue must not be a political question. And finally, the court cannot issue advisory opinions. These hurdles function as jurisdictional prerequisites. Failure on any one point stops the case dead in its tracks before the merits are ever reached. We begin our deep dive into the 5 hurdles with the first and most frequently litigated element of standing: injury in fact. To satisfy this requirement, the plaintiff must demonstrate they have suffered a concrete and particularized invasion of a legally protected interest. Let us break down those terms. Concrete means the injury must actually exist. It cannot be abstract or theoretical. Particularized means the injury must affect the plaintiff in a personal and individual way, not merely as a concerned member of the general public. Furthermore, the harm cannot be conjectural or hypothetical. It must be actual or immediately impending, imminent. For instance, a direct economic loss suffered by a business owner clearly meets this standard. Conversely, a generalized grievance, such as being upset that the government is spending tax dollars inefficiently, is typically insufficient because that harm is shared equally by millions of citizens. Establishing a genuine, personal injury is the essential first step toward proving you have the right to bring suit. Having established the necessity of an injury in fact, we now turn to the second and third constitutional requirements for standing: causation and redressability. Causation demands a direct, traceable link between the defendant's challenged action and the plaintiff's suffered injury. It is not enough that an injury exists. The plaintiff must show that the defendant's specific conduct is what caused that particular harm. Next is redressability. This element requires that a favorable court decision, whether through an injunction ordering action or an award of damages, is likely to remedy or fix the specific injury the plaintiff experienced. Critically, the plaintiff bears the entire burden of affirmatively demonstrating all 3 elements: injury in fact, causation, and redressability. Only when these 3 hurdles are cleared can the court proceed to analyze the merits of the constitutional claim, ensuring the judiciary addresses only concrete, redressable disputes. Having established standing, we now turn to the temporal requirements for judicial intervention, ripeness, and mootness. These doctrines ensure the court addresses a live, concrete controversy, not a hypothetical one. Ripeness dictates that the dispute must have matured sufficiently before the court can intervene. Courts must avoid deciding premature claims based on speculative future harm or uncertain administrative action that may never materialize. Conversely, mootness requires that the controversy remain alive throughout the entire litigation process, from filing to final judgment. If circumstances change during the lawsuit rendering judicial relief pointless, perhaps the challenged regulation is repealed, the case is dismissed as moot. However, an important exception exists. If the issue is deemed capable of repetition yet evading review, the court may still hear the case, typically when the challenged action is inherently short-lived, like pregnancy cases or election disputes. We have covered the temporal requirements of ripeness and mootness. Now we address a doctrine rooted deeply in the separation of powers, the political question doctrine, or PQD. The PQD is a prudential bar, meaning it is a self-imposed restraint, preventing federal courts from hearing cases that are constitutionally committed to another branch of government, typically the executive or the legislative branch. The seminal case establishing the framework for identifying these questions is the Supreme Court's decision in Baker v. Carr. In Baker, the court outlined several factors to determine if a matter is non-justiciable because it presents a political question. Key among these factors are whether there is a textually demonstrable commitment of the issue to a coordinate branch, or whether the court would have to fashion standards for resolution that are clearly lacking in the judicial toolkit. It is crucial to contrast this with cases involving political actors that are justiciable, such as challenges to malapportionment, which Baker itself resolved. The PQD ensures the judiciary does not trespass into areas reserved exclusively for political decision-making. We have now examined the full spectrum of judicial gatekeeping. Remember the core tension. Judicial review is the inherent, fundamental power of the judiciary to interpret the Constitution and invalidate contrary law. However, this immense power is not boundless. The justiciability doctrines, standing, ripeness, mootness, and the political question doctrine, serve as the necessary, self-imposed restraint on when that power can be exercised. These doctrines compel the court to act only as a neutral arbiter resolving concrete disputes between truly adverse parties. By adhering strictly to these jurisdictional prerequisites, the judiciary preserves the constitutional separation of powers, ensuring it does not overstep into policy making or issue non-binding advisory opinions. This careful balance between power and restraint defines the legitimate scope of the federal courts.